Welcome back to the Deep Dive. It is Friday, February 20th, 2026. And look, I'm going to be completely honest with you. I woke up this morning, looked at my phone, and immediately wished I hadn't.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those mornings.
It's one of those mornings where the notifications are just stacking up on the screen, and every single one of them is flashing red. We are looking at a geopolitical map that is, frankly, looking a little terrifying today.
It is.
The world is effectively holding its breath right now because this crisis between the United States and Iran has stopped being a simmer. It is starting to look like a full boil.
It's incredibly tense. I think it is undeniably the most dangerous moment we have seen in the region since June of last year, the 12-day war. And honestly, it potentially goes much further back than that. The structural pressure is just much higher now.
Right. Okay, so for everyone tuning in who maybe hasn't refreshed their feed in the last hour because things are moving that fast, let's set the scene for you. The breaking news as of this morning is that the Strait of Hormuz is partially closed.
Which is the absolute nightmare scenario.
Exactly. The single most important energy choke point on the entire planet. And this follows that massive military drill by the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, which they called Smart Control. That wrapped up 2 days ago, but the disruption didn't stop when the drill stopped.
No, it didn't. And usually that's how these things work, right? You do the drill, you flex the muscles, and then everyone goes home. But they haven't gone home. And simultaneously, we have diplomats sitting in Geneva trying to talk everyone off the ledge.
But the reports coming out of our sources there are not good. The word deadlocked is being thrown around a lot.
Deadlocked, stalled, complete lack of trust.
And to add fuel to the fire, we have President Trump issuing this 2-week ultimatum to Tehran, which, if you have a good memory, sounds eerily similar to the language we heard leading up to June 2025. So the big question, the one everyone is asking you right now is this it? Is this World War III? Or is this just another round of high-stakes poker where everyone folds at the last second?
And that is exactly the confusion we are here to clear up. Because if you just follow the timeline on social media, you're going to get whiplash.
Oh, absolutely.
One minute it's bombers are launching, the next it's peace in our time. Our mission today is to cut through all of that noise. We aren't going to look at narratives or feelings. We're going to use a very specific tool today for this analysis. We're using the Bulldozer framework, specifically version 3.1.
The Bulldozer framework?
Yeah.
I have to say, I love that name. It sounds so blunt.
It's designed to be blunt. It's a tool for pure realpolitik analysis. And I always have to credit the architect who designed this framework because it completely changes how you view these crises. The core philosophy is simple. Ignore what politicians say.
Because politicians lie.
Politicians lie. Diplomats spin. The framework dictates that we only care about hardware and stress. We look at physical realities, missile inventories, cash reserves, inflation rates, death tolls, because hardware doesn't lie. A missile is either deployed on a launcher or it isn't.
Okay, I really like that approach. Hardware doesn't lie. So when we apply the Bulldozer framework to Iran right now, what is the hardware actually telling us?
The hardware is screaming system overload. Within the framework, we use a metric called the stress index. It's a scale of 0 to 10. Right now, as of this morning, Iran is sitting at a 7.6.
The 7.6.
That is deep in the red zone. That is a system that is vibrating so hard the rivets are starting to pop out.
Before we get into the missiles and the military hardware, help me understand this 7.6 number. Because usually when analysts talk about tension, it's very vague. They say things like tensions are high or concern is mounting. It's flimsy, but you're giving me a specific decimal point.
Right, because saying concern is mounting is analytically useless. The stress index is designed to be like a pressure gauge on a hydraulic press. You know those videos online where they crush things with a press?
Yeah, they're oddly satisfying to watch.
Exactly. But think about the machine itself. The gauge on that machine measures PSI, pressure per square inch. It doesn't measure if the pressure is good or bad, it just measures structural load. So on our scale, 0 to 3 is green, normal function. The machinery of the state is humming along. The post office works. The borders are quiet.
Makes sense.
Then 3 to 6 is yellow, elevated tension. Maybe you have some localized protests, maybe a minor border skirmish. Inflation ticks up a bit, but it's manageable. The government has the bandwidth to handle it.
And then we get to the danger zone.
Right. 6 to 8 is orange, bleeding into red. This is where you hear the structural groaning. This is where the state is taking on way more pressure than it was ever designed to hold. You have failing infrastructure, mass unrest, external military threats, and economic collapse happening simultaneously.
All at once.
All at once. And 8 to 10, that's black. System rupture,
Rupture meaning what exactly?
meaning the machine physically explodes, revolution, total war, regime collapse. The government essentially ceases to function.
And you're saying Iran is currently at a 7.6.
Correct. And context is absolutely key here. Back in November 2025, which was just a few months ago, Iran was sitting at a 5.2. That was yellow. Wasn't great, but it was stable. Jumping from a 5.2 to a 7.6 in roughly 90 days. That is a massive vertical spike. It means the system is going critical.
And this score comes purely from the hardware metrics.
Precisely. We completely reject feelings. We look at 5 specific dimensions or buckets: military hardware, the economy, internal politics, external relations, and choke points. We calculate the stress in those 5 buckets, and right now, almost all of them are flashing red on the dashboard.
Okay, let's break down those dimensions for everyone listening. Because I think people hear that Iran is in trouble and they just shrug. They think, well, Iran is always in trouble. But you're saying the economic dimension specifically is just off the charts right now.
It is. Dimension 2 is the economy, what we call economic asphyxiation. The score there is a 9 out of 10.
A 9 out of 10. That is effectively a failed state score.
It is dangerously close. To understand why it's a 9, you have to look at their currency, the Rial. I want to give you a very specific comparison so you can really feel the weight of this collapse. Go back to 2015.
Okay.
This was around the time the original nuclear deal, the JCPOA, was being finalized. Back then, the exchange rate was about 30,000 rials to $1 US.
30,000 to 1. Got it.
Today, as of this morning's trading, it is trading at 1.1 million to 1.
Oh my God. 1.1 million to 1.
Just think about the sheer math on that for a second. If you had your entire life savings in cash tucked under your mattress in 2015, let's say you were saving for a house or your kid's wedding, you have effectively lost 99% of your wealth. It's just gone, vaporized into thin air.
That destroys the entire middle class overnight. You can't plan for the future when your money melts in your pocket.
Exactly. And it's not just about imported luxury cars being expensive. It's basic survival. It's we can't import insulin. It's we can't import spare parts to keep the power grid running. Inflation is officially running between 40 and 60%, but for essential goods, it's often in the triple digits.
And this isn't an accident. I mean, the Iranian government isn't just suddenly terrible at math. This is the result of deliberate external pressure.
Yes. This is the hardware of sanctions at work. And we really need to be clear about what the word sanctions means in 2026. Because I think a lot of people hear that word and they think of a boycott. Like, okay, America just won't buy their pistachios or their oil.
Right, a trade dispute.
It is not a trade dispute. It is a 21st century medieval siege. The U.S. Treasury, under Secretary Bessent, has been very explicit about this strategy.
Right.
They aren't just blocking oil sales anymore. They are cutting Iran completely off from SWIFT.
Can you explain SWIFT for us? We hear the acronym all the time in the news, but what does it actually mean to be cut off from it?
Think of SWIFT as the secure messaging app for global banks. If you want to send money from a bank in Germany to a bank in Dubai, that message goes through SWIFT. If you get kicked off that system, you are effectively excommunicated from the global financial church. You cannot move money legally.
So where do they?
They have to use smugglers, literal suitcases full of cash, shadow banking networks. And doing that raises the cost of doing business by 30 to 40% just on transaction fees alone.
So every single thing Iran tries to buy, whether it's food, medicine, or industrial parts, costs 40% more just for the privilege of paying for it.
Exactly. And on top of that financial blockade, the U.S. is blocking the import of industrial software and microchips. So if a massive machine in a factory breaks down in Tehran, they can't just download the software update to fix it. It's a slow-motion strangulation of their entire industrial base.
That sounds absolutely brutal.
It is brutal. And the goal, and this is cold hard for, Realpolitik isn't just to annoy the regime. The strategy is to deliberately force poverty and desperation. They are trying to drive the Iranian public to such a point of absolute desperation that they have no choice but to flood the streets. The strategy is to induce a system rupture from the inside.
Which brings us directly to Dimension 3 in your framework. Internal politics.
Yeah.
Because that strategy of squeezing the population, it kind of worked, didn't it? We saw massive violent protests just a couple of months ago.
We did. And this brings the score for Dimension 3 to a 7 out of 10. We refer to these as the December-January protests. They ran from late December 2025 right through to mid-January 2026.
I remember seeing the headlines, but the numbers of people involved were all over the place. One day it was a few hundred, the next day they were saying thousands.
Right, because in authoritarian regimes, the numbers are always foggy. They restrict the internet, they block reporters, but even the most conservative estimates we have are horrific. The death toll ranges from 3,117 on the absolute low end to upwards of 36,500 according to opposition groups.
Wait, 36,500 people dead? That isn't a protest. That is a civil war.
It was a massacre. And here is the key insight from the institutional analyst, specifically Vali Nasser from CSIS. He described these protests as an unorganized explosion.
An unorganized explosion. That's a really interesting phrase. What exactly does he mean by that?
He means there was no leadership structure. There was no Gandhi, no Mandela, no central committee issuing a list of political demands. It was just raw, visceral anger. It was people who literally couldn't buy bread, couldn't buy medicine, exploding onto the streets because they felt they had absolutely nothing left to lose.
Which makes it harder to negotiate with, I assume. If you're the government, who do you even call to make a deal?
It's impossible to negotiate with. There's no one across the table. But on the flip side, it also makes it easier to crush. Because there was no organized leadership structure to protect the movement, the regime could just use overwhelming brute force to clear the streets. And they did. The crackdown worked, in the strict sense that the streets are mostly empty today.
But the anger is still there. You can't just shoot 36,000 people and expect the survivors to just go back to work.
No. Vali Nasser's assessment is that the pressure is actually higher now. He says it will explode again. You have to understand the cultural context here. In Shia Islam, there is a very deep tradition called the 40th day. You mourn intensely 40 days after a death. When you kill thousands of people, 40 days later, you are guaranteed to have mass funerals all across the country.
And those funerals turn into new protests.
Exactly. They turn into political rallies. Chants against the supreme leader are still happening at these memorials right now.
So the regime is just sitting on a powder keg.
A powder keg sitting next to a bonfire. If the economy, which is the root cause of the pain, isn't fixed, the explosion returns. It's mathematical. And this connects directly to the diplomatic talks happening in Geneva right now. The regime desperately needs sanctions relief to survive internally. That is what drives their desperation at the negotiating table. They aren't negotiating for economic growth. They're negotiating for basic regime survival.
So they're desperate. But they're also heavily armed. And this is where the stress index gets really scary for the rest of the world. Let's talk about Dimension 1, military hardware. Because usually when a country is collapsing economically, when the currency is worthless and they can't buy bread, you expect their military to crumble too. Soldiers usually don't fight if they aren't getting paid. But that is not what we're seeing here, is it?
No, not at all. In fact, we are seeing the exact opposite. This is the central paradox of what they call the resistance economy. The military hardware score on the stress index is an 8 out of 10. The inventory is highly lethal, and more importantly, it is fully deployed.
What kind of inventory are we talking about? Because I think the general public pictures Cold War-era tanks and guys in pickup trucks.
That's the old image. You have to completely erase that from your mind. We are looking at an inventory of over 3,000 advanced ballistic missiles. But the real game changer in this specific crisis isn't the ballistic stuff they usually fly into Israel. It's the naval hardware, specifically the Abu Mahdi anti-ship missile.
The Abu Mahdi. Why does that specific missile get a name check in the framework?
Because it fundamentally changes the math of naval warfare in the Gulf. This is a long-range cruise missile with an operational range of over 1,000 kilometers. But the scary part isn't the range, it's the guidance system. It uses AI-assisted seeking.
AI-assisted. Okay, that's a buzzword we hear constantly. What does it actually do in a missile?
It means the missile isn't just flying blind to a pre-programmed GPS coordinate. It has onboard sensors that can literally see and evaluate targets. It can skim the ocean waves at an extremely low altitude to completely avoid radar detection. And then it can specifically hunt for the heat signature and the visual profile of a U.S. aircraft carrier and distinguish it from a commercial oil tanker. It is designed for one specific purpose, to sink a $13 billion piece of American sovereignty.
That is terrifying. You're not just shooting unguided rockets hoping to hit something large. You have a smart sniper rifle for ships.
Exactly. And during that smart control drill on February 17th, The one that just wrapped up, they didn't just parade these things around on trucks, they did live fire exercises. They fired the Sayad 3G air defense missile to show they can protect their coasts. They are sending a very clear message. Our economy might be completely broken, but our trigger finger works perfectly.
You mentioned earlier the lessons of June 2025. We have to talk about that because I think for a lot of people listening, last year's conflict, the 12-day war, is a bit of a blur. It happened so fast and it ended so fast. What exactly happened and why does it matter so much to the current standoff?
This is critical context. If you don't understand the lessons of June 2025, you cannot understand February 2026. In June of last year, Israel and the U.S. launched targeted strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities. Iran fired back, targeting the Al Udeid air base in Qatar, which is a major hub for U.S. forces. But, and this is the crucial part, that they deliberately hit empty buildings.
Wait, they missed on purpose.
Yes. They aimed for non-critical structures. Warehouses, empty hangars, empty dirt lots on the base. It was a performative strike. They wanted to show their domestic audience they could hit back. Without actually causing enough American casualties to trigger a full-scale U.S. invasion, it was a purely symbolic retaliation.
And then the U.S. ended the conflict for, was it 45 minutes?
Roughly 45 minutes of intense, overwhelming airstrikes, and then a ceasefire was immediately called. It looked like de-escalation had worked perfectly. The whole world sighed in relief. But the analysis from experts, again, going back to Vali Nasser's reporting, is that Iran learned the exact wrong lesson from that exchange. Or perhaps, from their perspective, the right lesson for survival.
Because what?
That symbolic responses do not work. They signal weakness to your enemies. They feel that because they held back in June 2025, Israel and the U.S. feel emboldened to squeeze them even harder now. The internal logic in Tehran is, we showed restraint, we didn't kill your soldiers, and in return, you gave us more crushing sanctions.
So the lesson they took away is, next time, do not miss.
Precisely. The new military doctrine is, use it or lose it. They believe that if another shooting war starts, they absolutely cannot afford to be symbolic. They have spent the last 6 months aggressively moving critical assets deep underground and rebuilding their command structures specifically for this moment. The intelligence assessment right now is that if a war starts today, Iran will not hit empty buildings in Qatar. They will target critical energy infrastructure. Think of the Abqaiq strikes in Saudi Arabia back in 2019. Or they will actively try to sink a U.S. warship.
So the stakes are infinitely higher now because that safety valve of a symbolic retaliation is completely gone.
Yes, the hardware is set to kill, not to warn.
This brings us to the broader geopolitics of it all. Because Iran isn't acting in a vacuum here. We keep hearing about the CRINC axis. I have to say I love that acronym. It sounds like a bad villain group from a comic book.
It really does. CRINC, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. But we have to be very careful with how we use that label in our analysis. It's not a formal binding alliance like NATO. It's not an attack on, one is an attack on all situation.
How so? How is it different?
It's a highly transactional relationship. This falls under dimension 4 in the stress index, external relations. The score here is a 6 out of 10. Let's look at Russia. Russia is completely absorbed in Ukraine. They are buying Iranian drones and ballistic missiles by the truckload because they desperately need them for their own war. In return, they might be selling Su-35 fighter jets to Iran, though the intelligence reports are conflicting on whether those have actually been delivered. But ask yourself, is Vladimir Putin going to send Russian ground troops or naval assets to fight and die for Iran in the Persian Gulf?
I seriously doubt it. They have their hands full as it is.
Absolutely not. And then you look at China. China is the really big player here. In our framework, China is the rational actor. They are Tehran's only economic lifeline. China buys roughly 90% of Iran's oil exports, completely ignoring U.S. secondary sanctions. Without Chinese money, the Iranian economy would have flatlined 5 years ago.
So China is essentially keeping the lights on in Tehran.
Yes, they are. But, and here is where the friction happens. China has publicly called the idea of closing the Strait of Hormuz irrational.
Because they need that oil to flow.
Exactly. China is the world's biggest energy importer. Closing Hormuz actually hurts the Chinese economy more than it hurts the United States. So Beijing is very quietly, but very firmly, telling Tehran, we will buy your oil, we will support you diplomatically at the UN, but do not close the gas station.
That leads perfectly into Dimension 5. The choke points. We have this dynamic you call the Tale of Two Straits. We have the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and the Strait of Hormuz. I think a lot of people conflate these two or think they're the exact same geopolitical problem. How do we distinguish them using the bulldozer framework?
You have to think of them as two very different types of wounds to the global system. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait down near Yemen is what we call a proxy wound. It's controlled by the Houthis, who act as Iranian proxies.
That's where we've seen all the drone and missile attacks on commercial shipping for the last few years.
Right. And the strategy there is asymmetric asphyxiation. The Houthis use incredibly cheap $2,000 drones to attack $100 million container ships. It forces major shipping companies to reroute their entire fleets around the Horn of Africa.
Which causes global inflation, supply chain delays.
It causes real economic pain, yes. It raises costs for everyone. But it doesn't stop the world from turning. You can sail around Africa. It takes a few weeks longer. It costs a lot more in fuel, but the goods eventually arrive. It's a flesh wound. It's painful, it's bleeding, but the global economy can survive it.
Okay, so contrast that proxy wound with the Strait of Hormuz.
Hormuz is the existential valve. It accounts for 20% of total global oil consumption and 20% of global liquid natural gas, or LNG.
And you can't just reroute ships around that.
You cannot. There simply aren't enough overland pipelines in the Middle East to bypass it. If Hormuz actually closes, the global energy market has a massive cardiac arrest.
But you said earlier that Iran closing it completely would be suicide for them.
It is. That's why Dimension 5 scores an 8 out of 10. Extremely high stress. The fundamental dilemma for Iran is what we call reverse asphyxiation. Iran also exports almost all of its own oil through the Strait of Hormuz. If they lay mines and close it completely, they're effectively cutting their own throat. They starve their own economy of the cash that China is currently paying them. It is quite literally economic suicide.
So if they know they can't fully close it, but they want to hurt the West, what do? What is the play?
The likely scenario, the one the hardware points to, is what we call asymmetric disruption. They take the exact same Houthi playbook from the Bab el-Mandeb and they apply it to Hormuz. They don't stretch a physical chain across the ocean. Instead, they use harassment. They drop a few sea mines. They use swarm attacks with those small, fast attack boats against tankers.
And what does that actually achieve if it doesn't close the strait?
It targets the global insurance industry. That is the real target. If they make those waters dangerous enough, Lloyd's of London and the other massive maritime insurers will raise their premiums to unbearable levels. A commercial ship captain will simply refuse to sail if the insurance policy costs more than the cargo he's carrying. So the maritime traffic stops on its own or slows to an absolute crawl without Iran technically declaring the strait closed.
Wow. That is a terrifying nuance. It's not a binary switch of open or closed. It's about making the route financially uninsurable.
Exactly. It's about creating intolerable friction in the market. They want to spike global oil prices to $150 a barrel to punish the West, hoping that the resulting economic pain forces the U.S. to back down and offer sanctions relief.
So we have the military hardware primed and ready, the domestic economy is collapsing, and the critical choke points are threatened. The only way out of this mess seems to be diplomacy. Which takes us back to Geneva. What is actually happening there? Or I guess, based on the reports, what is not happening there?
Geneva is currently a high-stakes game of chicken. It hasn't collapsed completely, but it hasn't advanced an inch. We have a fundamental structural impasse on the shape of a deal.
What does each side actually want?
Iran wants a binding text. They want guaranteed, ironclad sanctions relief, signed, sealed, and delivered before they give up a single centrifuge. They feel they have been burned before, specifically when the U.S. pulled out of the JCPOA back in 2018. Yeah. They simply do not trust verbal promises anymore. They want a signed contract.
And the U.S. side, what is the Trump administration demanding?
The U.S. wants a declaration. They want Iran to formally declare a complete surrender of its nuclear ambitions and its proxy funding first. They view it as, stop all the bad behavior, dismantle the threat, and then, and only then, will we discuss how much economic relief you get.
So Iran says, pay us and we'll stop. And the U.S. says, stop and maybe we'll pay you.
Exactly, and the trust deficit between the two sides is absolute. It is zero. Iran feels this is a gun-to-the-head negotiation. They look at the U.S. armada gathering in the Gulf and hear, sign our paper or we bomb you. Meanwhile, the U.S. and Israel feel that Iran is just dragging out the talks to stall for time, inching closer and closer to a nuclear breakout capability, while the diplomats argue over commas in Geneva.
Caught in the middle of all this are the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar. You mentioned earlier that they're in a state of mortal panic.
Mm-hmm.
Why? I mean, Usually, historically, they want the U.S. to be extremely tough on Iran.
They do historically, but their internal calculus has completely changed. This is a fascinating geopolitical shift. In 2019 or 2020, they might have actively cheered for U.S. strikes against Tehran, but now they have Vision 2030.
Right, the massive economic modernization projects.
They are investing over $100 billion to pivot their economies entirely away from oil. They're pouring money into AI infrastructure, luxury tourism, and global finance. You cannot host a global AI hub or build a trillion-dollar futuristic city in the desert if you are sitting in the middle of an active war zone.
Because war is notoriously bad for business.
War destroys their hard-earned status as a safe zone for foreign investment. If Iranian missiles start hitting data centers in Dubai or financial districts in Riyadh, that Western capital immediately flees to Singapore or Zurich. So the Gulf states are now actively mediating. They are not allying with the U.S. military buildup. They are frantically trying to prevent the U.S. from striking because they know they will be the primary collateral damage targets for Iranian retaliation. They realize they are the biggest glass house in the neighborhood.
That is a massive reversal of roles. The Gulf states acting as the desperate peacemakers just to protect their AI investments and IPOs.
It's purely rational self-interest. Capital hates uncertainty, and war is the ultimate uncertainty.
So we've looked at all the pieces on the board. Let's look at the final dashboard. We promised the listener a verdict at the beginning of this deep dive. The stress index is sitting at a 7.6.
A 7.6. The system is deep in the red zone. Breakdown is imminent.
Let's recap those dimension scores quickly.
Sure. Hardware is an 8. Economy is a 9. Internal politics is a 7. External relations is a 6. And Chokepoints is an 8. You average that out, you get 7.6 out of 10.
And your Bulldozer framework dictates that a system cannot sustain this level of pressure indefinitely. It has to release.
It must release. The physics of the system dictate it. And there are only 2 types of release valves available at this point. One is a violent release. War, massive airstrikes, the mining of Hormuz. The pressure vessel simply explodes outward.
And the second option?
A negotiated release. A deal in Geneva, even a temporary phase 1 deal that lowers the economic pressure. Sanctions relief is literally the only thing that lowers the PSI inside Iran right now.
So for you listening to this, trying to figure out what happens next, what should you be watching, we talked about falsifiable metrics. What are the specific indicators on the dashboard in the next 2 to 4 weeks that will tell us which way this goes?
We have 5 key falsifiable metrics on the dashboard. If you see these lights blinking red, you know exactly where we are heading.
Okay, give them to me. Metric number 1.
Metric 1. Protests. Do they return in late March or April? We are coming up on the spring holidays. If organized mass protests return to the streets, the regime might consciously choose to start a war to distract the domestic population. It's the classic rally round the flag effect. If the streets get too hot to handle, they might make the borders hot to compensate.
Okay, watch the streets of Tehran. Got it. Metric 2.
Metric 2.
Yeah.
An Israeli or U.S. preemptive strike, does it happen in the next 2 weeks before the ultimatum expires? Keep a close eye on military movements.
Right. Metric 3.
Metric 3 is continuous. Houthi action. Do they actually manage to sink a U.S. ship? Not just damage it with a drone, but put it at the bottom of the ocean. This is the ultimate red line for U.S. escalation. If a destroyer takes a direct hit and American sailors die, the political pressure in Washington for a massive, disproportionate response becomes completely unstoppable. It forces the president's hand regardless of the Geneva talks.
That's the tripwire. Okay, metric 4.
Metric 4, Geneva. Does a phase 1 deal emerge by the end of March? If we get to April with absolutely no deal, the odds of a peaceful resolution drop off a cliff purely due to the timeline of Iran's nuclear development. The diplomatic window is physically closing.
And finally, metric 5.
Metric 5 is a daily check. Oil prices. Does Brent crude sustain a price above $90 a barrel? Right now, it's fluctuating wildly on the rumors, but if it locks in and stays above 90, it means the global market has officially priced in a war. The smart money, the guys running the quantitative algorithms, are placing their bets on conflict.
There's one variable we haven't touched on quite enough, though, and I know the framework struggles with this. It's what we call the human bug, or SPF3.
Right. The Bulldozer framework measures hardware perfectly, which is highly logical, but it struggles to account for the human bug. The ultimate decision makers here are still human beings. We have a cornered, desperate Iranian regime that might feel humiliated, and on the other side, we have a highly unpredictable Trump administration.
And humans don't always act rationally.
They don't. History is full of regimes that actively chose suicide, meaning A war they knew they couldn't mathematically win over the humiliation of a public surrender. A cornered animal doesn't always calculate the odds. Sometimes it just bites. That is the SPF3 variable. It's the inherent glitch in the logic of deterrence.
So with all that data on the table, what are the final odds? Where do the experts stand?
The consensus is incredibly tight. Analysts like Michael Ratney and Vali Nazar are putting it at a dead even 50-50. They see the massive constraints weighing on both sides.
But others are slightly more pessimistic, right?
Yes. Ziada puts the chance of war at 51%. Farsak has it at 55%.
And what does your bulldozer model say?
The bulldozer model aligns with the more pessimistic view. We put it at 55% for war, 45% for peace.
Why the tilt towards conflict?
Because of the hardware. The military readiness is simply too high and the economic collapse is too severe. The status quo is impossible to maintain. When you have a complex system operating at a 7.6 pressure level, the default tendency of that system is rupture, not stability. Stability requires active, difficult diplomatic work. Rupture just requires gravity. A break is inevitable. The only question left is the direction.
That is incredibly sobering. A 55% chance of war.
It is. But you have to remember, 45% for peace is not zero. The Gulf states' absolute desperation to mediate, the immense Chinese economic leverage, these are incredibly powerful brakes on the car. But the car is speeding downhill and the brakes are smoking.
So to wrap this up and synthesize everything for the listener, Iran is in the red, a 7.6 out of 10. The military hardware is fully deployed. The economy is suffocating. Geneva is the only viable off-ramp, and right now, it is completely blocked.
That is the stark reality of the board today.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We talk about the Iron Trinity, the U.S. alliance network, the technological superiority, the overwhelming financial power. It seems totally invincible on paper.
It does. But here is the provocation for you to explore on your own. The Iron Trinity is strong, but an unsynchronizable node like Iran, a state that is seemingly willing to burn its own house down just to ensure the whole neighborhood catches fire, is the ultimate glitch in that system. We always assume every global actor primarily wants to be prosperous and connected. Iran is reminding us right now that some actors value resistance over their own survival, and that brings us back to the core of the framework. Hardware doesn't lie. Iran is in the red. We are looking at either a violent release or a negotiated surrender. Watch the metrics and ignore the noise.
That is a haunting thought to end on. Thank you for listening to this deep dive. This was custom built for you to help you navigate this chaotic geopolitical landscape without getting lost in the spin. Keep watching those 5 metrics on the dashboard. We'll see you next time.
Stay safe out there.